Chapter 15. Athanasia sat curled up in a grand, cushioned chair by the open balcony of her private study in the Emerald Palace. A warm breeze carried the scent of roses into the room, but she barely noticed. Her sapphire blue eyes flickered over the stack of documents on her desk, but her mind was elsewhere. The court's whispers had reached her ears long before Anna had confirmed them. Countess Rosalia had left Jeanette to take the fall. The realization left a bitter taste in her mouth. She wasn't sure what angered her more, the Countess's betrayal or the fact that Jeanette had accepted the punishment without protest. A faint hum of magic rippled through the air. Before she could turn, a familiar voice drawled from behind her. "You look like you're about to murder someone, Princess." Lucas lounged against the windowsill, arms crossed, his dark robes blending into the late afternoon shadows. His ruby-red eyes flickered with amusement, but there was something sharper behind his usual smugness. Athanasia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Maybe I should." Lucas tilted his head, his gaze narrowing. "Don't tell me you're actually considering interfering again? You've already saved it once. If you push any further, His Majesty might start thinking you've gone soft or worse crazy." Athanasia shot him a look, unimpressed. "Hardly." She leaned back, the golden light of the setting sun catching the delicate embroidery on her sleeves. Claude wasn't known for leniency. If she pleaded Jeanette's case too often, it could weaken her standing. "Jeanette doesn't deserve to take the full weight of this," she admitted. "Rosalia let her be punished to save herself. But if I ask my father to spare Rosalia, I'll look like a fool, both figuratively and literally. Why would I help someone who wants to take my place?" Lucas studied her for a moment before sighing dramatically. "If you ask me," he smirked, eyes glinting with mischief. "Why not let it handle this problem by itself?" Athanasia frowned. "What do you mean?" Lucas leaned closer, tapping a finger against her forehead as if she were slow to catch on. "If it really wants to prove itself, then let her. Give it the chance to stand up for itself, for once." Athanasia hesitated. The idea was tempting. Lucas was right, and she wasn't blind. Jeanette had always craved attention, validation, and a place in the imperial family. If she was smart, she would use this opportunity to prove herself in the imperial court, that she wasn't a dog, a fool, or a tool to be used by anyone. "It's not your responsibility to deal with anyway. Let it fend for itself. It's not like it did anything to help you back then." Athanasia's fingers, which had been idly tracing the embroidery on her sleeve, stilled. Her gaze flickered to Lucas. "Back then?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Lucas met her gaze, unbothered. But there was something in his expression, something unreadable beneath the usual arrogance. "Nothing," he said lazily, pushing himself off the windowsill. "Just a thought." Athanasia studied him for a moment longer. She knew Lucas well enough to sense when he was holding something back, but she also knew better than to push. If he wanted to tell her something, he would, eventually. A slow smile spread across her lips as she turned her attention back to the matter at hand. "I suppose it's about time she did." The murmurs in the palace had grown louder in recent days, each whisper tinged with disbelief and curiosity. The noble circles were baffled, and even the palace servants had begun to gossip in earnest. There was one question on everyone's lips: why had Countess Rosalia faced no consequences for her slanderous actions against Princess Athanasia? It was a mystery that seemed impossible to solve, given the emperor's notorious protectiveness over his daughter. But what puzzled them even more was the shocking event that had taken place in the imperial court. While the countess had escaped without so much as a reprimand, her niece, the second Princess Jeanette, had been publicly humiliated. In a display of rare anger, Emperor Claude had slapped Jeanette in front of the entire court, a moment that would be remembered for years to come. He then announced that she would be put on probation and confined to the Sapphire Palace, a decision that sent shockwaves through the nobility. Athanasia, seated at her desk, gave him a fleeting glance before continuing her work. "His Majesty hasn't punished the Countess yet," one maid whispered to another as they carried linens through the hall. not even a formal reprimand, the other replied, shaking her head. It's strange, isn't it? The last noble who spoke ill of the princess lost everything overnight. Countess Rosalia, the architect of this mess, had not been punished for her role in the scandal, while her niece bore the brunt of the emperor's fury. This, the nobles knew, would have far-reaching consequences for Jeanette's already fragile reputation. As Athanasia worked in her office in the main palace, the nobles' murmurs reached her even through the stone walls. They had been speculating all afternoon, discussing the events in hushed tones as they moved through the hallways. The gossip only grew louder as curiosity swirled among the courtiers, and soon, a nobleman, Viscount Laurent, approached her with the question that had been plaguing them all. Dressed in his formal attire, he bowed before her desk with the practiced ease of someone used to courtly decorum. "Your Highness," he began carefully, "if I may be so bold as to ask, why has His Majesty not taken action against Countess Rosalia? Given his well-known affections toward you, many in court expected a swift response." Athanasia, who had been reviewing a trade agreement, finally looked up. She stared at him for a long moment, sapphire eyes cool and unreadable, before speaking. "What's the point?" she said flatly, setting down her quill. "The Countess's plan has already backfired. She wanted to ruin my reputation. Instead, she dealt an even bigger blow to her niece's already poor standing." A murmur rippled through the nobles who had gathered nearby, drawn in by the conversation. The Viscount blinked, considering her words. She was right, of course. Jeanette's position had always been precarious, more of a shadowy figure in the court rather than a true princess. But now, with her aunt abandoning her to save face, her situation had worsened significantly. The Viscount nodded slowly. "I see. Countess Rosalia may have avoided immediate consequences, but if she cannot protect her own niece, then Jeanette's standing will only continue to decline in the long run." Another noble, a baroness known for her sharp wit, let out a soft chuckle. "Quite ironic, isn't it? The Countess's entire purpose was to elevate the second princess, yet by her own actions, she has only ensured her downfall." The nobles exchanged glances, the realization settling in. Jeanette had not spoken out against her aunt, nor had she taken any decisive action to defend herself. To the court, that was a sign of weakness, one that would not be forgotten. Slowly, murmurs of approval spread throughout the gathered nobles. "Princess Athanasia truly has remarkable foresight," one whispered. "Rather than act rashly, she let the Countess destroy her own credibility," another added. "She truly is the Emperor's daughter," someone else muttered in admiration. Athanasia, listening to the praises with mild amusement, simply returned to her work. She hadn't needed to lift a finger. The court had drawn its own conclusions, and as expected, it was already turning against Jeanette. The Countess had saved her own skin, for now. But in doing so, she had left her beloved niece vulnerable. And in the imperial court, weakness was never forgiven. As Lucas walked through the grand halls of the main palace, the whispers of the noble ladies grew louder. Their eyes were glued to him, tracking his every step with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. His arrival had set the court abuzz, the younger noblewomen especially fascinated by his presence. They watched him like a captivating puzzle, intrigued by his dangerous aura and the mystery that surrounded him. "He looks so dangerous," one of them whispered breathlessly, her voice barely a murmur over the chatter. "Those dazzling ruby eyes. It's like he could pierce through your soul with just one glance." Her friend, who was clutching her fan a little too tightly, couldn't help but nod in agreement. "And that dark look, his black suit, the brown leather belts, and that green wizard straitjacket. It's like he stepped out of some forbidden fantasy." Another girl giggled, leaning over to whisper in her friend's ear. "He's so much more handsome now, isn't he? Remember when he was just that strange boy with long black hair and those odd ruby eyes? He's grown up into something entirely different." The young ladies exchanged looks, fanning themselves and giggling behind their hands as Lucas's figure disappeared into the hallway. They were mesmerized by his every movement, and it was clear that no one in the room could resist watching him. Yet not all eyes were focused on Lucas with admiration. A few of the young noblemen, standing near the palace's opulent columns, exchanged glances filled with resentment. They watched Lucas with a sour expression, their jealousy palpable. They were aware of his favored position, both with the emperor and with Princess Athanasia. To them, it was an open display of favoritism that was hard to swallow. One of the young men, a noble with sharp features and a haughty posture, couldn't help but sneer as Lucas passed by. He leaned toward his companion, his voice barely above a murmur but full of disdain. "Do you see him? How smug he is. Does he think we can't see through it? All that attention from the emperor, and now from the princess herself? It's sickening." His friend, a tall man with blonde hair and a more subtle distaste for Lucas, nodded in agreement. "It's not just the emperor who seems to favor him. The princess, too. He's always so close to her. It's unnatural, isn't it? What does he have that we don't?" They both watched Lucas with envy, their eyes narrowing as he walked past them, ignoring them completely. The young men were bitter, their pride wounded. Lucas's reputation had skyrocketed, but it wasn't just his mysterious allure that fascinated the court, it was his seamless transition from a boy who had once been considered somewhat strange to the powerful young man he was now. They had all seen him as a child, the long-haired boy who never quite fit in. Now, as a young man, he seemed untouchable, his ruby eyes piercing, his black attire only enhancing his dangerous persona. "I don't know why His Majesty is letting him get away with everything," one of the noblemen muttered, glancing at his friend. "Remember the Sapphire Palace? He destroyed it and repaired it without breaking a sweat, and not a single word of punishment. Meanwhile, Jeanette, who's already out of favor with the emperor, gets put on probation for slandering Princess Athanasia." The other nobleman scowled, crossing his arms. "It's a joke. Jeanette might be disliked, but what about Lucas? He gets away with anything. The emperor and the princess clearly trust him more than anyone else in this palace. It's frustrating." There was a tense silence as they both watched Lucas disappear deeper into the palace. The young nobleman couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, that Lucas was more than just a favored individual. His close connection to Princess Athanasia made their jealousy burn even hotter. They had all witnessed it, the way Lucas had held his ground when he destroyed the Sapphire Palace, and the way he faced no repercussions at all. He was practically untouchable, and it grated on the other nobles' nerves. In the newly reconstructed Sapphire Palace, Countess Rosalia did her best to stay as far away from Lucas as possible. The tension in the air was palpable every time their paths crossed. Though they were both under the same roof, Rosalia could feel the gulf between them growing wider by the day. She couldn't shake the thought that the young man who had destroyed the palace with a mere flick of his temper was now somehow above reproach, while her own niece, Jeanette, had been punished and placed under probation for slandering Princess Athanasia and the royal family. The maids, once respectful toward Rosalia, now regarded her with disdain. The shift was so subtle, but unmistakable. Before, they'd seen her as someone of importance, an esteemed guest and a person of influence. But now, after Lucas's outburst that had torn down the Sapphire Palace, they seemed to worship him as if he were the emperor himself. They had witnessed his destructive power firsthand, and he had managed to repair the palace as though it was nothing. The sight of the newly restored palace, gleaming and pristine, only reminded Rosalia of her dwindling position. In the corridors, the maids could hardly contain their awe as they worked. The place now sparkled with cleanliness, the air fresher, the stones polished to a perfect shine. The walls were free of the soot that once marred the ceilings. The whole palace felt like a brand new creation, and the maids were eager to share their amazement. "Damn," one of the maids muttered, glancing at the newly restored walls as she wiped down the windowsills. "We should have just let Master Lucas destroy the palace earlier if it meant it'd look this good. Look at how clean everything is, there's no more soot on the ceiling, and the stones, they practically gleam. This place is way easier to clean now." Another maid, scrubbing the floors with renewed energy, nodded in agreement. "Right? I swear, it feels like we've been given a whole new palace to take care of. Whoever thought it would be Lucas who'd make it all better? Margaret, the senior maid, smirked as she stood near the entrance, surveying the pristine space. Lucas may be temperamental, but he knows how to get things done. Look at the place now, it's like he's given us a fresh start. I don't mind cleaning it now. The younger maids giggled amongst themselves, exchanging amused glances. Their words, dripping with admiration, were lost on Rosalia, who lingered nearby, her expression darkened by anxiety. Her mind was in turmoil. She knew she needed to protect Jeanette, but she couldn't bring herself to face the Emperor or Princess Athanasia again, not after everything that had happened. Jeanette had slandered the first princess, and despite the punishment she'd already received, Rosalia feared that her niece's reputation would continue to plummet if she didn't step in. But what could she do? The Countess, once a respected figure in court, now felt powerless. She feared that if she tried to shield Jeanette any further, it would be her own head on the chopping block. The Emperor had been lenient with Jeanette, but Rosalia was not so certain that he would show the same mercy to her. She had been the one to spread the rumors, after all. If the truth came out, there was no telling what kind of consequences she might face. The Emperor had already punished Jeanette severely. For Rosalia, it would likely be far worse. Execution? The thought made her stomach churn. Rosalia's mind raced, but the weight of the situation left her frozen in place. She wasn't sure what to do next. The maids continued their murmurs, but Rosalia was too consumed by her thoughts to listen to them. She was beginning to fear that she had no allies left. She couldn't rely on Athanasia's protection the way she had with Jeanette. The princess had already moved beyond her, she had a kingdom to rule, after all, and the Countess was nothing but a small piece in her grander plan. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to redeem herself. Jeanette's probation wouldn't last forever, and if she could make it through this trial without further incident, perhaps she could find a way to restore the girl's reputation. But Rosalia knew she had to act fast, before the Emperor or Lucas made a final decision about her future. The fear of losing everything crept into her thoughts, and she knew that any mistake now could cost her everything. She had to make it up to Jeanette. She had to protect her niece, no matter the cost. But Rosalia had no illusions about how difficult that would be. She might be the one to fall next if she wasn't careful. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.